All right, so let's talk about homicide. So, as I'm sure we all know, there are different degrees of murder. So, first degree murder, the worst. So, first degree murder, this is where the killing happens after premeditation. So, it was considered beforehand and deliberation. It was planned rather than opportunistic. And although sometimes if you have really brutal, cruel, or extreme cases of homicide, then it doesn't always require premeditation, but typically that's the defining feature. It also includes felony murder. And this is because this would be so. For example, somebody commits a robbery and then they kill somebody during the commission of the robbery, or they're committing a burglary and then during the commission of the burglary they didn't think anybody was home, but then somebody was there and then they kill that person. That's felony murder because what the law does is it takes the premeditation for the felony and applies it to then the homicide that occurred during the commission of the felony, which is why it's considered first degree murder. There are sort of aggravating and mitigating factors that can affect this, but typically first degree murder is kind of the worst of the worst. So then second degree murder, so this is still, it's still very serious, but you have, there's malicious intent, or malicious aforethought. So they did intend to kill the victim. The intention was to kill the victim, but you didn't have that premeditation or deliberation beforehand. Sometimes this is sort of coined as saying, wanton disregard for human life. Often the case of things like aggravated assault, especially with a weapon that escalates in the moment. So the intention was still to kill the person, but it wasn't the plan ahead of time, and it wasn't felony murder either. So if it's committed with a felony, then that would jump into first degree murder. If it's extremely cruel or brutal, that would escalate it to first degree murder. So second degree murder doesn't have those things. But it does still have that malicious intent. And sometimes cases that may be considered first degree or sometimes drop to second degree if intoxication is part of it. Because if the offender is intoxicated, then it reduces the ability to premeditate, but not always. So it doesn't mean that just because somebody's drunk, they can't be charged with first degree murder. But often that's sort of a mitigating factor from first degree murder to drop it down to second degree. So then we have the two different types of manslaughter. So non-negligent manslaughter, also known as voluntary manslaughter, is sort of the worst of the two manslaughters in the sense that there's no sort of malicious intent or reckless disregard or anything like that, because that would make it second degree murder. So the killing is still intentional, but it's a reaction to provocation, emotional distress, something like that. So this is sort of the killing in the heat of passion. So, the bar fight that goes farther than intended, the husband who walks in and kills his wife's lover, or, any other kind of killing in response to provocation or even intense fear, shooting an unarmed attacker. There was no real threat, but there was, the person was fearful. Murdering and cannibalizing another human being in order to stay alive when you're lost in the wilderness. That would be non-negligent manslaughter. Shooting a neighbor you believe is an intruder. So there's no malice present, but the intent is still to kill the person. It's just sort of in that moment. And that sort of intention, that the intent is still to kill, that is what differentiates it from negligent manslaughter, which is involuntary manslaughter. And so this is where you have an offender kills the victim by accident, but it's because of some reckless behavior or disregard for safety that amounts to criminal negligence. So the best example of this, the drunk driver who either kills another motorist or a pedestrian, because yes, they were totally stupid to get behind the wheel of a car when they were drunk, but they did not intend to kill anybody. So the intent is not there. But it's still reckless disregard and criminal negligence, which is why it's still a type of manslaughter. Or you could have the doctor who carelessly gives the wrong prescription or the wrong dosage to one of their patients. That could be negligent manslaughter. A gun owner who doesn't responsibly lock away his weapons. That would be negligent manslaughter if his weapons are then used in a crime to kill somebody. So, or an accident. It also, though, includes sort of a duty to act. So, for example, if you have a dominatrix, say, who doesn't seek help for a client who's suffering a heart attack, that is something that she could be charged for. State government officials in Flint, Michigan, who were charged for deaths that were resulting from the poisonous drinking water that was covered up. That's negligent manslaughter. It's that idea of criminal negligence. But nobody wanted anybody dead, but people were dead because of negligent behaviors of certain people. Failing to report a spreading fire, especially if you caused that fire. That would be negligent manslaughter. It also includes misdemeanor manslaughter. But basically any of these things it's all about criminal negligence. So there's no intention. Nobody wanted anybody dead. So it was an accident, but it was because of some reckless behavior or disregard for safety. So those are 4 main types. And I mean, sometimes things are pled down, and so really it was a case of first-degree murder, but the person was actually charged with second-degree or non-negligent manslaughter or whatever. But the actual sort of defining feature as to how the law defines each of these is sort of how I've laid it out. So when we look at the nature and extent of murder, so the murder rates are declining, just like all crime, especially all violent crime. Everything is basically going down. Murder tends to be an urban crime because large cities are more likely to experience structural disadvantage. So things like poverty, unemployment, social disorganization, all that stuff tends to happen in bigger cities, which we know causes crime, especially violent crime. And then it's more likely to have also more gangs and drug-related killings and things like that tend to happen more often in cities. So it tends to be an urban crime. Victims and offenders both are often male and young. So about 80% of victims and about 90% of offenders are male. So males are also more likely to kill in public. So often somebody of equal social standing. So that's like gang members and drug offenders and things like that. While women, if they are going to be an offender, they're more likely to kill in private, and typically they're killing intimate partners or sometimes their children or other family members. And when we talk about young and age, so about a third of victims and about half of all offenders are under the age of 25. So it doesn't mean that they're all young, but that's kind of the biggest group would be young people, especially offenders. It's also a very intra-racial crime, meaning that people tend to kill members of their own race. About 90% of victims are killed by somebody of their own race. And typically, people don't start with murder. So typically, murderers have committed some other kind of crime. Not always, but usually. So when we look at sort of the relationship between victim and offender, we look at spousal offending. So the rate has gone down overall, but the rate of men killing women they live with has actually gone up. Could be because of the loss of power and control that some men feel because of the increasing independence of women. Could be also women often kill spouses if it's ongoing domestic violence. So although support for these women has gone up, which could explain the decline in those specific types of murders. Jealousy, often a factor, like love triangles and things like that. Women, though in those situations, women are going to kill their partner. Men more often kill the wife's lover. So in both situations, the man is the one that's most at risk. So when we look at victim-offender relationships, most victims are known to the offender, and stranger homicides are relatively rare. So you're much more likely to be killed by somebody that you know, so that's always good to know. Luck and Bill had this interesting study in 1977. He talked about the collective transaction and applied to cases. He applied this specifically to cases of homicide. And so basically he talked about the idea that each participant develops a role. So offender and victim both develop this role, and then that's shaped by the other person in the transaction. And so basically, ultimately then they play a part in their own death. And so since the victim's actions antagonize the offender in some way, even if it's totally unintentional, like a child who refuses to stop crying, it's still an antagonizing factor that's perceived by the offender as entrance into this agreement where violence and force are acceptable tools to be used. And so then the victim essentially contributes to their own demise. So while this can definitely be seen as victim blaming, it's still this idea of how you can view the event of that a victim in that situation is having as much of an impact as the offender is, because you can't just take out the effect of the victim. They are affecting the situation. So that's kind of what that really has to do with. So stranger perpetrated homicide, rare, but this number is actually, it's increased a little over the past decade or so. Often it occurs during the commission of another crime, so typically this is where you see felony murders happening, or intergang conflict, so that you've got your bystander deaths and things like that, and bystanders catching stray bullets. But typically the felony murder tends to happen during like rapes, robberies, burglaries is the most common. It also could be going up a little because of tougher sentencing. So things like 3 strikes laws, which then that increases the marginal deterrence. So that's, well, I might as well commit murder since we're going to be going to prison for life if we're caught anyways. So that's what the marginal deterrence thing is that, well, if, somebody's committing a felony, let's say, and they're like, oh crap, I feel like I'm going to get caught for this. Well, then it's better to kill the person and have a higher likelihood of getting away with it regardless of how you're caught, whether you're caught with your 3rd robbery or homicide, you're going to prison for the rest of your life anyway. So, or for 25 years or whatever it is, depending on the state and country. But specifically for the 3 strikes stuff, then that's, of course, they're going to say, well, I'm going to just kill this person and increase my likelihood of getting away with it if the punishment is the same. And that's the marginal deterrence argument. And so this could be because of this tougher sentencing, particularly for felony murder. So school violence is something that it's much more common. Violence and bullying are both more common. About 10% of students report bringing weapons to school. And when we look especially at school shooters, which is obviously a major factor in the United States over the past decade or more, school shooters are often trying to send a message. And there are sort of those red flags that you can go back and see after the fact. It's always easy to see them after the fact. But they're trying to send a message typically before the shooting, and often they express suicidal behavior. So a lot of that is seen after the fact, but there is a lot that can be said about that.